The Queen of Attolia, a Queen's Thief novel by Megan Whalen Turner, narrated by the Reading Dragon. Chapter 3. Eugenides stood in his cell with his shoulders against the damp wall. Resting the back of his head against the stones made the front hurt worse, so he dropped his head toward his chest. He didn't want to go back to sleep. He imagined his grandfather waiting for him at the gates of the afterworld, and he didn't want to have to tell him that he'd spent the last few hours allotted to him napping. The old man would not be impressed by false nonchalance. All the tools of his trade were still tucked into their pockets in his clothes, but none of them was of any use. No part of the locking mechanism on the door was accessible. Eugenides had checked. Pulling himself away from the wall, he staggered along it. His balance was off, and he kept his right hand on the wall to steady himself, feeling the cool stones with his fingertips. There was a gouge in the heel of the hand. The pain from that wound distracted him from the worse one in his head, and from the innumerable tears where the dogs had caught him with their teeth. He circled the cell. There was no window with bars to be filed through. The only light came through the narrow opening in the door. There were no loose stones or miraculous tunnels, and the door remained unshakably closed. Silently, he called on the god of thieves, but didn't even know what to pray for. Should he pray to die quickly? It seemed too much to ask to escape Attolia entirely. In the end, he prayed for help, any help, and left it to the god to decide what was best. Someone slid a tray of food through the slot in the bottom of the cell door. He staggered to the upper part of the door and looked out at the prison keeper. "I heard she was going to hang you, but she changed her mind," said the keeper. "Don't worry, lad. She never changes it for the better." He laughed and banged the bars of the window with his truncheon. Eugenides snatched his fingers away. "Enjoy the meal. It might be the last," the man advised as he moved away. Eugenides sat down to drink the watery soup, but left the hard chunk of bread beside the bowl. He didn't enjoy his meal, but sick as he was, he probably appreciated it more than any of the other prisoners in the Queen's cells. Once sitting, he didn't have the strength to stand. His head hurt abominably. He could neither rest it on the wall behind him nor lean it on his knees, pulled up in front of him. Finally, reluctantly, he lay down and pillowed it on his arms, and darkness closed over him again. His grandfather would heap scorn on him like coals. He was still asleep when the keeper returned much later. "Look lively!" he yelled into the cell. "She's made up her mind!" While the keeper turned the key in the lock and pulled the door open, Eugenides struggled to his feet and was standing, though unsteady, when the prison guards came in to take his arms. He walked between guards down underground passages to an open doorway. The room stank of blood. He could smell it from outside, and he hesitated. But one of the guards nudged him forward. He took a shaky breath and stepped across the threshold. There was fire burning inside on a circular hearth surrounded by a low stone wall. Long-handled iron tools that looked like blacksmithing tools, but weren't rested on the wall, their tips in the fire to heat. The fire smoked, and the room was unbearably hot. There was a huge wooden framework threaded with ropes and pulleys, oddments hanging on hooks on the walls that Eugenides didn't want to see. And dragged out to the middle of the room, sitting cockeyed to the fire, covered with dust as if it had been stuck in an unused corner for a long, long time, was a chair with overlong arms and leather straps to keep a person in it. Near the chair, dressed for dinner in a cool green gown the color of sage leaves, was the Queen of Attolia. Embroidered around the neck of the dress was a ring of flowers, white petals on the green ground, with delicate leaves a shade darker than the dress. The thief stopped in the doorway. He looked from her to the chair beside her. He was puzzled only for a moment. He looked back at her, but cried out to the patron god of thieves. "God, no!" He threw himself backward. The guards caught at him. He sank through their arms, then stood again to drive the heel of his hand up under one guard's nose. The guard dropped as if he'd been hit with an axe, but it was all the strength the thief had in him. He grabbed for the doorway, but they pulled his fingers free one by one and carried him, thrashing, to the chair. The guard swore, but the thief made no sound that she could hear, except that one plea to his God. She had thought believers were as rare in Eddis as they were in Attolia. The thief, though, had seemed to cry out in earnest, not merely from habit. Faith did return in extremes, Attolia observed. She had seen that happen before. Finally, the guards forced him into the chair, and as they did so, banged his head against the back of it. The little fight remaining in him went out in a breath. His eyes rolled white in his head, and his head dropped to his chest. After a time, his eyes opened, and he lifted his head again. The leather straps fixed him to the chair, and he couldn't move. "Your Majesty," he turned to her and said desperately, "let me serve you. Let me be your thief." Attolia shook her head. "I offered you a position in my service once before. You refused me for a mistress you said was more kind." "I could serve you now," Eugenides whispered. "Could you?" Attolia asked. "Yes," the thief swore. She could see the tendons in his neck as he strained against the straps. With plausible seriousness, the queen asked, "What could you steal from me, thief?" "Anything," he assured her. "I can steal anything." "And why would I trust you?" "I would give you my word." "Your word?" The queen was amused. "What good is that?" "Not good at all." Attolia smiled. "And what about your queen? She would rather see you serve me than see you suffer? Did she tell you so before you left Eddis?" "She had." "Of course," said Attolia. "And Eddis has nothing I want, so you are no threat to her. What a wonderful tool you are, one that cannot be turned against your mistress." She bent over him, reaching for him with both hands. He shuddered at her touch, but she only cupped his face in her hands and looked into his eyes. "Your queen thinks she is safe sending you to me because I cannot use you against her. I think I can. And what I want is not what Eddis chooses to give me." "Your ambassador says your queen has accepted my right to have you hanged," said Attolia, "but not to have you flogged to death, nor to have you hung upside down from my palace walls, nor to have you starve to death in a cage in the courtyard. He says I mustn't exceed the restraints of law and tradition. He says I might offend the gods, though he didn't say which ones. I care very little for the opinion of any god, but I still think tradition might hold the best solution to my problems with you." She released him and stepped back. A burly jailer unracked a curving sword from its place on the wall. Eugenides had been frightened before, so frightened that he'd felt as if his heart had turned to stone in his chest. Seeing the sword in the jailer's hand, he looked again at the queen and felt the whole world turn to stone. The air around him was solid, and he was suffocating. He threw himself against the leather straps of the chair, against the solid air around him, against the obduracy of the Queen of Attolia. He begged, "Please, please," as if his heart were breaking. The man beside him lifted the sword. It caught the firelight on its edge a moment before it swept down, biting deep into the wooden arm of the chair. His right hand disappeared behind the blade. Attolia saw his body jerk against the straps. She had expected him to cry out, but he made no sound. He turned away from the sight of his right arm, and she saw his face grow white as the blood under his skin drained away. His eyes were squeezed closed, his mouth twisted in pain. He struggled for breath as his thoughts circled like birds that couldn't find a perch, searching for a way to change the truth, to change the Queen of Attolia. But her decision was final, the action irrevocable. "Eugenides," he heard her cool voice through the agony. "Have I exceeded the restraints of tradition? Have I offended the gods?" And he heard someone whisper in his voice, "No, Your Majesty." "Cauterize the wound," the Queen said briskly, "and have a doctor check it. I don't want it infected." The cauterizing iron was ready, and she stayed to see if he would scream when it was applied. He jerked again against the straps, but still made no sound, only breathed in sharply and didn't let the breath go. Attolia watched as his lips flushed blue, and then he fainted, his head dropping forward to his chest, his dark hair covering his face. She leaned close to be sure he breathed again, then repeated her instructions to have a doctor check the wound for infection, and left. As she climbed the narrow staircases to the upper part of her palace, she thrust aside her feelings of unease and concentrated instead on where to temporarily relocate the court. She thought she might move inland. It was time to look into the affairs of the barons there. She would give the necessary orders to begin packing. 3 days later, she stood in the doorway of the thief's cell. She could hear him before she could see him, and she listened to his labored breathing as her eyes adjusted to the dark. He lay on his side in a corner of the cell, with his injured arm cradled against his chest and a knee pulled up to protect it. He sweated in the damp cold of the cell and didn't move until Attolia prodded him with one slippered foot. He opened his eyes and looked up at her without expression. The lamp that someone held behind her shone down on his face, and she could see the scar on his cheek. His skin was so pale that the scar showed dark against it. His eyes were bright, and she bent down to look into them, expecting the hatred she often saw in the faces in her prison. But in Eugenides' eyes, there was only fever and pain, and an emotion she couldn't put a name to. "Please," he whispered. His voice was low but clear. "Don't hurt me anymore." Attolia recoiled. Once, as a child, she'd thrown her slipper in a rage and had knocked an amphora of oil from its pedestal. The amphora had been a favorite of hers. It had smashed, and the scent of the hair oil inside had lingered for days. She remembered the scent still, though she didn't know what in the stinking cell had brought it to mind. She bent over Eugenides again, needing to be sure her punishment had been effective. "Eugenides," she said, "what can you steal with only one hand?" "Nothing," he answered hopelessly. Attolia nodded. Edis would think twice before risking a favorite in Attolia's power. He was very young, she realized. She hadn't considered his age before, and reminded herself that his age didn't matter. All that mattered was the threat he posed. Still, seeing him huddled on the floor, she felt a little surprised that Edis would endanger someone so young. But Edis was not much older, Attolia thought. Not many years ahead of Edis herself, Attolia was a far more experienced queen. She turned to the jailer. "I said I wanted a doctor to check him." "He did, Your Majesty." "The bites on his leg are infected." She pointed with one finger at the swollen red skin that showed through the torn cloth. The prison keeper looked suddenly wary. "He checked the burns, as you ordered, Your Majesty." "Only the burns?" "I suppose, Your Majesty. Those were your orders, Your Majesty." Attolia sighed in irritation, a familiar, not uncomfortable emotion. "If I didn't want him dead of one infection, why would I want him dead from another?" I'm sorry, Your Majesty." "You'll be sorrier." She turned to the captain of her guard, who had accompanied her. "Get him back to Edis before he dies." She left the cell and made her way up the many stairs of the palace to her private anteroom. She passed through it and into her bedchamber, where she sent away her various attendants and sat for a long time in a chair looking out over the sea as the last sunlight faded from the sky. She dismissed thoughts of the thief lying on the floor of his cell, but found herself thinking instead of her favorite amphora, broken, and the oil spilled. Thank you for listening to my narration of this story. If you like my narration and want to hear more, please hit that like button, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and follow me on Twitter at Ava2star so that you can be notified of when I post a new video. Thank you again for listening to The Reading Dragon.